The world is old and the powers are weary. The god at the door of night has fallen, and the great enemy of the world has come back from the timeless void. The shadow has awakened the great evils to regain dominion over Ardar. Darkness shall cover the land, if not for the deeds of a small fellowship of elf friends. Join the players of this Dungeons & Dragons campaign as they fulfill the events of the Dark or Daggeroth prophecy and strive with Morgoth on the plains of Valinor. Welcome to the Undying Lands in Part 3 of the Inglorion Bastards trilogy, Trials of the Valar.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to episode 135 of the Inglorion Bastards podcast. With me tonight, I have Doug Anderson. Some of you will know him as Douglas A. Anderson. He is an American writer and editor on the subjects of fantasy and medieval literature. He specializes in the textual analysis of J.R.R. Tolkien. And his first published work, if you can believe that this was his first published book, was The Annotated Hobbit, which won the Mythopoeic Award in 1990. Like a lot of my past guests here, he's an editor, or was an editor, of the Tolkien Studies Journal, but he was a founding editor of the Tolkien Studies Journal. So welcome to the podcast, Doug.
Thanks for having me.
I tried to cover briefly a little bit about you, but now is sort of the time that I ask our guests to talk a little bit about themselves. And of course, the thing that our listeners are really going to want to hear about is how you came to Tolkien. What was the gateway drug for you for Tolkien?
Back when I was 13, I was visiting my older sister, who's 9 years older than me, and I remember it was the summer of '73, and I was bored out of my mind because there was nothing to do. And I kept looking at her bookcases and wandering around her apartment and complaining there was nothing to do. And so finally, at some point, she stomped in from the kitchen and she grabbed 4 volumes of those Ballantine editions of The Hobbit and the 3 volumes of Lord of the Rings with the Barbara Remington covers, and she thrust them at me and she said, "Here, read these. You'll like them. Now leave me alone." And I, of course, thought, "Oh God, The Hobbit. Who would read? Who but my sister would like a book with a title like that?" And of course, the covers were not very, instantly appealing either. If anyone remembers those Barbara Remington covers, because they certainly don't as attractive as they are in some ways, they don't represent the books inside as others. But
Ted Naismith had some things to say about those books.
Well, so when I was leaving then to go home, she said, "Oh, take them all." And I said, "Well, let me take the first 2," and because I didn't think I was going to like them. My sister's taste at that point ran to Richard Brautigan's Revenge of the Lawn and things like that, which did not appeal to me then, nor even now. So I got home, and of course, I found I liked it, and I read them. Within a day, I read both, and
Sure.
And I had to call her up, and I said, "Bring me the other 2," and she's like, "Well, I'm coming tomorrow," and I'm like, "No, bring them now," and she did. So, those copies, I literally read them to pieces. More so. The first and second volumes as opposed to the third, though I did pretty serious damage on the appendices. But the volume 1, I don't know how many times I read from like Council at Elrond through the Moria chapters over and over and over again. Appealed to me. Then when I was in high school, my freshman year of high school, the English department was running a big classroom where we had 4 teachers, and then it split off into some separate groups. And they threw a bunch of plays on the table and said, "Oh, you're going to have to pick one and act it out with your friends." And it was a bunch of Neil Simon plays, which I had a precocious disgust for Neil Simon back then. And I didn't want to do any. So I said, "Well, and my teacher said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do The Hobbit." They said, "Well, there's no dramatization of it," which of course was a falsehood, but I didn't know that at the time. And I don't think they knew it either, But I said, well, I'll write one. And so
Wow.
surely that to humor me, they said, okay, if you write one, we'll let you do it. And so I wrote one, and me and my friends performed it for the class, and the teachers liked it so much they arranged a group of us to tour all the elementary schools in the area.
Oh man, please
And
tell me you have a recording of this somewhere.
oh God, no, God, no. This would have been 1974, so
All right,
no.
all right.
I have a copy of the play itself, which I should burn before I die. It's remarkable only in the sense that it was something that was begun and finished by a 14-year-old.
So the Hobbit's been with you for a while. I mean,
Yeah, that was my first, and then from there on, it was I fortunate had the I wonder nowadays with someone coming to Tolkien and seeing this massive amount of scholarship and critical and Tolkien's own writings, all of none of the history of Middle Earth, not even the Silmarillion was published back then. So I was one of the original group that was so excited to hear that the Silmarillion was actually coming out, in
mhm.
1977. I do remember, I remember seeing on the news, it would have been September of 1973, notice of the death of Tolkien. Because I remember thinking, oh gosh, of course, here I find a writer I like, and he dies.
Yeah.
Um, but my sort of I got to, in a sense, grow up with all of these new books as they came out, and so I did a a paper for my high school class on. I went to college, and after my first year, I took a summer program in Oxford, which was way cool in many ways. That was 1978, and I that was my first introduction to fandom and I wrote to Humphrey Carpenter, Tolkien's biographer,
Sure.
and asked if he would sign a copy of his book for me and just meet. And he wrote back yes. And so I remember I ran around all the stores of Oxford trying to find still a first printing of his biography, and I did find one, and I've got it, to this day,
Oh
inscribed
wow.
inscribed to me from in July of 1978. And we Humphrey and I got to know each other a bit, and we bumped into each other casually in Oxford a couple of times after. And when I got back to the States, I sort of wrote him a thank you letter, and he wrote back and said he was just about to embark upon a biography of W.H. Auden, and he needed a research assistant in the U.S. who would who could help him find people and things and copies of articles and stuff, and would I be interested? And so I said sure, and that was really my introduction to literary scholarship, and so I did a whole bunch of work for him in that sense, and he came over. And we both went around New York City into some of the archives in that, and worked for a few days in that. That would have been fall of '79. His Auden book, I think, came out in '81, but at that point he'd started too doing the letters volume. So he asked me to help in ways on that, and um, it was through him and through work on the letters volume, because once he put it together, I'd been to the Houghton Mifflin's archives in Boston and got to see their papers and their collection of stuff on Tolkien they had at the time. And I found some letters that they didn't have in the letters collection. One of which is it was a typed page from a 1938 letter from Tolkien that gave his description of the Hobbit. So I sent that and some other things to Humphrey, and he went, "Oh, great! We'll have to put that in." And so they did. And he sent me a copy of the book, the manuscript as it was put together, and I sent a huge commentary on it. I don't know, it must have been 20 some pages typed, and it went to him and to Christopher, just as because I was asked as a sympathetic U.S. reader, but what might be explained or added. And so over those 3 or 4 years, we worked a lot together, and that was sort of my mentorship in literary scholarship in that. And he after he put me in touch directly with Christopher, and
Wow.
Probably about 1980, maybe 79, 80, something like that. And so, Christopher and I were in touch for many decades until his sad recent passing at
Absolutely.
95.
Yeah.
But my interest in Tolkien evolved in many ways over the years because you got initially you get involved in the story, you get involved in the details of the world, and then my interests, became, the background, what were the full sources. He was a professor of studies of Anglo-Saxon and Norse, and so I got interested in them, and so I got interested in what was the fantasy tradition like before Tolkien, what were the books Tolkien read. I got interested in publishing history, and Tolkien's own publishing history is unique in many ways in that there was the pirated edition of the Lord of the Rings published by Ace Books while Tolkien was still alive. And
Hmm.
so as I learned these new pursuits, I brought them and their interest to them. When Humphrey and I were working on Auden book, there was a wonderful book by C. Bloomfield and Edward Mendelsohn called W.H. Auden, a bibliography, a descriptive bibliography. And so that was such a marvelous resource that I thought, oh, I want to do one like that on Tolkien. So I started in on that about, must have been 83 or 4, and soon found that there was someone named Wayne Hammond who was doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So we basically combined our resources at that point. When the book finally came out, it was I was still living in Ithaca, New York, which is where I went to college, and I worked at a bookstore, and we'd just taken over. Me and another employee and one other person had just bought out the business and opened it up as a new one, and I was swamped. And I basically said to Wayne, "It's like, here, go for it, write it up, credit it." As by you with my assistance, and that's what we. So that's how that came
And which book was that?
The J.R.R. Tolkien, a descriptive bibliography.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
came out in '93, I think.
It was. Yeah. Yeah. And for the listeners, Wayne Hammond, and I believe his wife, is it Christina?
Yeah.
They've collaborated together on many Tolkien books, but probably they're most known for their Lord of the Rings and their Tolkien reader companions. Is that right?
That or the Art of J.R.R. Tolkien. This was when Wayne and I worked on that book. That was before he and Christina were married. She is British, and Wayne lives in Massachusetts.
Well, there's a ton of Tolkien scholars here in Massachusetts. Wayne and Mike and Corey's not far
Corey's
away.
not far away. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you. Thank you for all that. That was a wonderful story. Going back a little bit from 1993, and I guess forward in time a little bit from your work with Humphrey Carpenter. In 1988, you published your first book, I believe, right? The
Yes.
Annotated Hobbit.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a copy here of the it's the revised and expanded edition, which you did, I think, in 2002.
Right.
It's a hardcover, beautiful book, and so I was wondering if you could tell us more about how this book came to be.
That came well. In working when I was working with Humphrey, I also got to know people at Houghton Mifflin, and I went there and visited their archives that were then in Park Street. Right up on the
Oh yeah,
Boston Common. They had a glorious old building there that was really historic with this, creaky wire cage elevator and all these nooks and crannies that went off in various different places. You find, some, this editor's little alcove and that editor, it was a place with real character. But at any rate, I visited there and I got to know Austin Olney, who was the editor in chief and the head of the trade and reference division. And one of the things that I worked on was the fact that Tolkien himself had revised The Lord of the Rings, as we all know, a couple of times, but he set a bunch of revisions to the British volumes, to the British publishers that never got put in the American editions. And these came out in the, I want to say second printing or third printing of the 1966 hardcovers. And then Christopher corrected a whole bunch of misprints in the 1974 printings. So there was this, and then there was a sort of errant branch that Tolkien sent revisions to the appendices of the Valentine edition because they were so sloppily printed, which added a few details which had sort of become legendary of amongst some Tolkienists. Is like, where did they come up with Stella in the family trees, because it's not in any other edition except Valentine appendices. So what I did was I suggested to Austin that we should fix up the American text and make them compatible, make them agree with the British ones, and
Mm-hmm.
it became a sort of more involved process than you might imagine. But what we were constrained in the 80s by how the production was done, and this affected my Annotated Hobbit too, of using films and photographs of existing texts, and they would make a new line and then paste it over in some ways. So we had to do all of that with the corrections. And similarly with the Annotated Hobbit, I was sort of stuck with this rectangular format because the text of the Hobbit itself was reproduced photographically from the then current up-to-date to the books. So I had these sidebars and bottoms in which to add stuff, which I was glad when things had evolved by 2002. At that point, the best text of the Hobbit was long been computerized, and we could merge it all into and make a much more sort of organic, flowing book.
Mm.
But the first project of any of it was to fix the text of the Lord of the Rings, and those were put in a printing that came out, I think, in early 1987. So, and I wrote the introductory note on the text to that, which that actually was my first publication. So to write the note at the front of your favorite book was kind of nice, and then I was working away, and I knew, of course, that similarly, Tolkien had revised the text of The Hobbit, most notably the Gollum chapter, in which, in the first edition, Gollum wasn't quite nearly the self-interested character he became in the later one. And so what I did was I thought about suggesting a variorum edition, to show here's the first edition text was not easy to find back then. It has since there have been facsimile editions published of the whole first edition text, and of course I put the text of all of the variants in my Annotated Hobbit. But the original impetus was to possibly do a variorum edition. So I took 5 editions of the book, I photocopied them, I taped them and pasted them together on these 1.5 by 4 foot sheets. And I took a ruler, literally, and read them across line by line. I had a bunch of colored pencils and highlighters that I marked, and this text was, corrected here with orange, and this one was blue, corrected here, and this was removed in highlighted in green. And went through all of that. And when I'd done all of that work, I realized that there really wasn't enough changes to justify a variorum edition. But certainly the changes were interesting and fascinating. So I happened to be talking to Austin Olney on the phone, and I said to him, I said, Austin, but there really isn't enough to justify doing a variorum edition. So I was thinking there are lots of interesting things one can say about The Hobbit otherwise. And the 1988 is next year is the 50th anniversary of the American publication of The Hobbit. Would you be interested in an annotated Hobbit? And he just said, "Oh, that's great." And as a publisher, the idea, of course, is you love to take anything that sells well and find a new way to sell it more. And so he's, and that's how it started. So I went in completely through the back door. Not, it was not like I wrote, dear editor, and said, I have this idea. So I was very fortunate in many ways with that. And things, of course, went from there.
I have another question for you about this book. So for the listener, I will say that there's a lot in here, and it's wonderful. Just if I can make a few notes here, there's notes on obviously different versions of the text, as you mentioned. There's probably, I think I read over 150 different pictures in here from various cultures that have published The Hobbit, which those are pretty interesting too, to see the different versions of like Beorn or like Gollum, someone like that. It has a thing that I find most interesting is the notes on where Tolkien may have gotten an idea for something. Like for example, there is the ever famous postcard of the German mountain man, and
They're Berggeist.
yeah,
Mountain
yes,
Spirit.
exactly. Yeah. So this is kind of that people are thinking this is where I guess Tolkien may have gotten the idea for Gandalf with the big hat.
No,
And
that was the common wisdom, which began with Humphrey Carpenter noted it in the biography where he says Tolkien preserved this postcard and in an envelope onto which he had written "Origin of Gandalf." So we all took him at his word, but when the third edition of the Annotated Hobbit is finished and out, there will be a much longer explanation of that
ah,
basically says no, um, because that artist Joseph Madlener um, painted those pictures that were made into postcards in the around 1934. So it is chronologically impossible for Tolkien,
ah,
who had written the bulk of The Hobbit by 1932, and certainly several chapters by January 1930. Um,
interesting.
but he clearly he there's one other instance where he used another postcard from that series of four postcards by Madlener that was issued in Germany in 1934, where he sent something to one of his former students. And I think it's actually dated 34, 35. So he must have gotten a set of those postcards and immediately recognized the impetus
Hmm.
of the mountain spirit, their Bergheist, and as compatible with Gandalf, and kept it.
I see.
But it's a nice story, but it's chronologically not possible.
Ah, you heard it here first, folks.
When I first did the Annotated Hobbit, came out in 1988 when I was 28, and the second edition came out 14 years later, so I was
Yeah.
42. And a tremendous amount of new material had come out between 88 and 2002, which one has to account for if one is going to, keep current in that sense. Also, one grows. I hope I knew a lot more when I was 42 than I did when I was 28. The book itself, the annotations, when I did the second edition, the annotations and introduction in that all came out to be even more text than The Hobbit itself. That's interesting. I didn't know I
Yeah.
was being quite that garrulous, you know. But there's one other thing about the second edition of the Annotated Hobbit that I like to point out, because most people don't seem to have noticed it, is as an appendix I put the text of the Quest of Erebor, which was Tolkien's, in a sense, rewriting of the Hobbit as a chapter-sized thing from Gandalf's point of view, that would have that was to be part of the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, but got pulled out for reasons of space. Christopher first published that in Unfinished Tales,
Hmm.
um, but he left out parts of it, and he let me publish the whole thing in the Annotated Hobbit, so you can read the
Oh
whole
wow.
text there. That isn't in it. All of it isn't in Unfinished Tales. So that's a nice point to notice.
So back to what I was going to ask you. I'm just curious. After photocopying all of those things and making marks and going through two editions and possibly a third edition, it sounds like maybe someday. Um, does it does it change and granted you're an adult now, but does it change your thinking or your enjoyment of the Hobbit when you read it these days? Or you probably know it so well that you haven't read it in a while, but I'm curious how that changes, because things like this, the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, they have become so much more than a story to so many people. I mean, do you look at them
You have
differently?
to. You
Yeah.
have to. I mean, it just from one's own personal growth and whatever. I read them so constantly from the age of 13, for several years afterwards, that they are, in a sense, completely part of my mental landscape.
Yeah.
And then when you approach it, as I did not long afterwards, um, with such attention to the minutiae of word choice and text, you also are reading it in a different way. So that when the movies came out, the Peter Jackson films of the Lord of the Rings, that was the first one was 2001, and my second edition of the Annotated Hobbit came out in 2002. And so I went around and I did this um, very fun slideshow about sort of the background history and the illustrations that had been done to The Hobbit, as promotion for the book. And what was nice about it is the book itself, I couldn't use very many color illustrations, but in the presentation, I could use all sorts of whatever from whatever editions and whatever artists, and
Hmm.
just and I could start at the beginning of the story and tell the story through visual images and show how the story had been interpreted culturally around the world, as well as by artists varying from, British artists like Alan Lee and John
Sure.
Howe, to who were both involved with the films, to others like Eric Fraser did a very nice. He mostly did chapter headings for the Folio Society edition of The Hobbit, which was in the early '70s. But there's a lot of quite interesting art that has been done over the times. Frank Frazetta did an illustration of Gollum that got put in a calendar in like 1973 or 74 or something. He's not someone you would usually think of as illustrating Tolkien. So, but with that, the illustrations, you could see culturally how the book was accepted, and some of it even hinged on textual things because when Tolkien first translation was published, was Hobbit was Swedish in the 50s, and then there were a few others. Portuguese was, I think, 62, and Japanese was 1965. And one thing with The Hobbit as a children's book, most foreign publishers were were interested in having sort of artists of their own culture interpret the story and publish illustrations along with it.
Sure.
Um, that was once The Hobbit itself became more acclaimed and well known. That pretty much ceased after Tolkien's death, after 1980s, and most foreign editions after that will have Tolkien's own illustrations, color and black and white. But what you got to see in some of the early illustrations was how Gollum was represented, and like the Swedish illustrations had this enormously huge rock-shaped hulking figure as Gollum,
Hmm.
or other ones that. So Tolkien himself was sent copies of these. Said something to the effect, Gollum must not be made into a monster. He was hobbit size. And so in the third edition of the text, 1966, Tolkien added a phrase. He says, deep down there by the dark water lived old Gollum. Period. That's the text how it read in 37 and 51. But he changed that to a comma and then said, a small, slimy creature.
Yeah.
So there you had the effect going backwards of the illustrations, foreign illustrations being done to The Hobbit, that then caused a change by Tolkien into the text itself to
Wow.
clarify more.
Oh man, I bet you have 1,000 of these stories.
Oh, I have the I call it the Hobbit illustration pool. I've got so many of them that, well, of course, it used to be a slideshow that I carried around, three slide reels with, full of them all in order. But now, since then, I basically have them all scanned and on computer. And when I get asked to do these talks, I basically say, "How long do you want?" But it's nice too because 10 years ago, some new recording had been discovered of an outtake of Tolkien reading one of the poems from The Hobbit, singing it to a song, and no one knew that. Dip the Baggins and crack the plates. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Da 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 da
Yeah,
da
yeah.
da 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 da.
My
And
kids
he had
love that one.
yeah, and there it was, Tolkien himself singing it to an old folk tune that we didn't know beforehand. And so I could, I had downloaded that from where it was on the HarperCollins had it on their website, and so I could play that slideshow where and say, here's Tolkien himself singing.
Well, it sounds like you came on the scene at the right time. You kind of grew up with these things as the originals came out, and
Oh, and
uh,
and especially with like the scholarship and all of Christopher's books, because you think I said this to Dimitra Fimi. It must be, gosh, about 15 years ago. We've known each other that long now, but she was just coming up. Had come to the Medievalist Congress for the first time and gave a presentation, and we were chatting afterwards, and I said, just how then, even in 2004, 2005, how did she manage to come out of stuff? Because it must seem daunting.
yeah,
Um, whereas to me, I was waiting eagerly for a new book almost every year, of Christopher's, and all of the scholarship on top, which I would devour as soon as I got my hands on it. But to be faced with such an opus, and she said basically, well, I set a goal, 50 pages a day, and I kept to it. And it's like, okay, I can see how
huh,
one would do that, but it must be scary to as much as one figuring someone now at 15 or 20 um, reads Tolkien, Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, and then wants to do more, and it's like faced with, where do you go from there? Part of what I how I viewed what I was doing with the Annotated Hobbit was, I wanted to take a characteristic Tolkien text and show ways to approach it visually, via Tolkien's own, medieval sources, via his modern sources, via his own artwork, via his writings for children. Everything. I wanted it to be a sort of a gateway into um, how to approach and read Tolkien. And I was asked a number of times, why didn't I go on and do Annotated Lord of the Rings? And Christopher even asked me once, and I said, well, to me that would have been doing the same thing again. It
yeah,
didn't really interest me. It would have been great on terms of the minutia and the study of the evolution of the text of Lord of the Rings, but as a overarching concept of ways to approach Tolkien, I'd already done it, with the Annotated Hobbit. So I said no every time I was asked.
yeah. Well, can I ask about something else that you've written?
Uh
If we
huh.
could fast forward from the second edition of the Annotated Hobbit, or I should call it the revised and expanded edition. So
I always call it AH2.
well, you came out with something called Tales Before Tolkien, the roots of modern fantasy, and this actually touches on something that Mike Trout and I talked about, how Tolkien wasn't necessarily the first person to have invented languages in his book, or he wasn't the first person to have fictional maps in his worlds
Right.
or appendices, but he was kind of the person to put together the first prototype fantasy novel with all of those aspects.
That was about the easiest idea I'd ever sold to a publisher. Was I'd had this idea for some time, sort of been accumulating things for it, and I was working in a bookstore then, and of course, I've done a lot of work which you'll see on my blogs, over the years on the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series, which ran from 69 to 74 and published about 70 odd fantasy titles. It was this thing that sort of defined what fantasy literature was for the generation just before me and my generation. And so I wanted to approach Ballantine, who had been the publisher of that, and I asked my sales rep for Ballantine, who called. I was the book buyer at a bookstore, and I asked him. I said, "Oh, do you know the editor Betsy Mitchell well enough to ask if she'd be interested in seeing a proposal on this?" And he said, "Oh yeah, sure." So I sent it to him. He sent it to Betsy, and my idea for the book, the title was "Roots of the Mountain: Fantasy Before Tolkien."
Oh, that's a good title. I like that.
And the marketing department nixed it, and they wanted, of course, Tolkien in the primary part of the title, which, well, it makes sense. And they submitted, I don't know, 3 or 4 alternatives, which the least awful of which was Tales Before Tolkien. So I took that. I said, okay, that I can accept. And the Roots of Modern Fantasy was not my and they put some other blurb on the cover that says the works that inspired Tolkien. And so a bunch of the reviewers said, well, there's only some titles in here that inspired Tolkien. And it's like, well, that's what I said in my introduction. And that was, I didn't. So what the editor or the author is not always responsible for how their book is presented to the public, but I think they did a nice job presenting it otherwise. But it's a little bit of misdirection in defining what it was. But when one sees various strange things as one gets reviews of things, I remember one of the first reviews um, took me for task for including some really common Lewis Carroll story. And there's no Lewis Carroll story in the book. None whatsoever.
Oh,
And it's like, which book did what do we know? So you wonder, it's like, how much do viewers actually read of books? But a copy found its way to Michael Moorcock, and he loved it, and he gave me a wonderful blur. If you know Moorcock, he as a I'm sure you know him as a fiction writer because he's hugely
mhm.
prolific. But he also was marked himself out as a famous Tolkien basher for writing this essay called "Epic Pooh" in
Oh,
1978, in which he knocked Tolkien and of course Winnie the Pooh as being sentimental drivel. Um, and so he's taken pleasure over the years as being a Tolkien basher, but he gave me a wonderful blurb for it that they put on the mass market paperback of the Tales Before Tolkien. So I take a perverse pride in having a Michael Moorcock blurb on my
oh,
Tolkien
geez.
related book.
Well, could I want to ask you one thing that I'd mentioned before that we haven't touched on was your involvement in the Tolkien Studies Journal.
Uh huh.
I was wondering if you could, can you talk about sort of how that came to be? And Mike told a little bit about how he, found sort of the at West Virginia University, how he talked to someone there, and how sort of the journal came to be. But how you became involved with it, maybe.
Well, I got to know Mike first via mail or email because he was working on the mail from the critics, and we met for the first time at one of the medievalist congress that's every year in Kalamazoo here. And one of the things I said to him was, I said, I've long wanted to do a journal Tolkien studies. And I said, but I can't do it on my own because I'm an independent scholar. I'm not affiliated with any academic institution. And it would need to be done with someone, to have that academic credibility. And he said, I've been thinking the same thing. Let's do it. And so we talked, and it came up we should have a third person, and we both immediately said Verlin Flieger. So that's how it got born. It was out of conversation, and we tried approaching a number of publishers who most of them had very standoffish, no, we won't do that, not interested. Um, and Mike knew the head of West Virginia University Press, who was Pat Connor, who was a nice fellow and an Anglo-Saxon scholar. So Mike knew him from professional reasons, and somehow they were just chatting, probably at another medieval congress, about something, and Pat was saying, "Oh, we want to get into doing some more journals," and Mike said, "Well, by the way, would would
Yeah.
you be interested in a Tolkien studies?" And Pat said, "Sure." So that's how it came about with West Virginia University Press, and I was involved with it for the first 9 volumes, and Pat left after, I don't know, I think after about 8 volumes, and they got a new director, and it had been fun and good working with Pat, but I had difficulties with the new director. I've written about it on my blog when this happened in a post called "Publishing Mordor Style." But basically, I mostly served as book review editor on Tolkien Studies, which meant I solicited reviews from people and arranged to get them books and got review copies, etc. And I was supposed to get reimbursed for my expenses for them. Um,
Ah,
and and they accumulate. You send one book to someone in England to review, and it's $36.
yeah.
So I had a small number of hundreds of dollars that was owed to me, and I'd saved all those receipts, and I sent them to West Virginia University Press, and they wouldn't pay me anything,
Oh,
and they wouldn't reimburse anything. And on top of the fact that academic publishing is basically a scam in that they pay nothing anyways. So all of the work that Mike Berlin and I had done, and all our reviewers and all our contributors, was basically for free, so that the publishers could rake in fees that they get for making the stuff available via library subscription databases, and particularly Project Muse,
ah,
which they get lots of money for. And then this new director who wouldn't repay my expenses. I just said, "That's it, I'm done."
yeah.
And within, yeah, as soon as word got out that I was out, I was approached by 3 different entities wanting to start up a new Tolkien journal. One of which I won't name the publisher, but basically wanted me to do the exact same thing as I did with West Virginia University Press for no money whatsoever. And I told them why I had quit West Virginia University Press, and I never heard from them again. But Brad Eden was one of the other people who was thinking about for similar reasons, about starting an online open access free academic peer reviewed journal, which so I was invited and accepted to become the book review editor of that. So I'm doing basically the same thing as I did at Tolkien Studies, but nobody's making money off of it. And
Well,
and
what,
it's
what,
called the Journal of Tolkien Research. It's you can do a Google search and it'll turn up. It started in 2014. There are, I don't know. What's one of the things that's nice about it is an article gets accepted and it's published within a few days, and
oh,
it's
wow.
free, and anyone on the web can get it, and we get to see stats of who's accessed it, and well, not who personally, but just what where the articles were accessed from. So when I see something that says within a day of something being published, that someone downloaded it from, for example, San Jose, California, I think, oh, that must have been David Bratton.
Yeah.
Or I see it some other place where it's a small town of somewhere, where I know someone else who lives. I said, oh, good, so and so has seen that, because but I've done the book reviews for that, and we're in. So and it basically every 6 months, or 6 months, it cranks over to a new volume. So there's and I think it's volume 9 is what we're in now. We're probably in volume 9, issue 2
Well,
is what will come up. But there's a little drop down menu at the left where you can go to any one of them. And I've got an index to this stuff published, um, an index to like the first 5 volumes published in volume 6, and there will be a new index shortly in the most recent one once I finish adding the last things, so you can see what has been reviewed there, who the reviewers was, and what articles have been there. And there are some there's a section of conference papers which are not peer reviewed, which are just stuff that people have presented at conference and they want to get out there, and they would be happy if people commented on them, so they're made publicly available that way. But it's an interesting venture, and I hope people interested in it will support it.
Well, I will definitely include a link to the Journal of Tolkien Research in the description of this episode, so people can check it out. You've mentioned your blog a few times, so I wanted to list that here, and I'll also include that. It's tolkienandfantasy.blogspot.com, and you've been doing that. I've gotten a few dates and names wrong during this interview, so I apologize, but I believe you started your blog in 2011. Is that
Oh,
right?
that could be.
Yeah.
I have enjoyed blogging in various ways. The first blog I was part of, and I'm still part of, is one called Wormwoodiana. And for about 15 years, it's still going. There's a journal, UK journal called Wormwood, that specializes in supernatural and decadent literature. And I had a column there called Late Reviews, in, I don't know, the first 30 some issues of it. It came out twice a year. And I collected the columns in a book a couple of years ago called, obviously, Late Reviews, where I had carte blanche to review any weird, obscure book that I wanted to, and sort of frame it in the sense of what's good about it, what works, what doesn't, whatever I wanted to say about it. And it gave me a chance to write about all of these obscure things that most people wouldn't have seen, or put into different perspective a lot of these obscure titles. Like one of which I reviewed at one point is called "The Word of Terragor." By someone named Guy Ridley. It came out in 1914. Well, basically, it's a sort of creation. It's a smallish book. It's a kind of creation myth about these trees that are mobile and walk around in a forest and
Ah,
gather together in moots.
interesting.
One of the trees is named Entith.
Huh.
There's no indication that Tolkien himself would have had read this, but it was published by an Oxford graduate in 1914 when Tolkien was at Oxford. So if it got any contemporary publicity, he might have heard about it, or he might have seen it, and I think it would have interested him. And so when I view my blogs, and I do about, I don't know, 7 or 8 different ones on different subjects. The Wormwoodiana, the Tolkien and fantasy is obviously about Tolkien fantasy, and it's sort of the main one. But if you go to that one, there are links to the other ones. There are a few fairly obscure authors that I particularly have specialized in that have their own pages. Kenneth Morris, a fantasist, and Leonard Klein is another one. And I do a blog called A Shiver in the Archives, which has to do with just weird, unusual research discoveries I've made.
Hmm.
And so that's the kind of thing. But I like the blogs because it gives a chance to. There's a lot of times when something you're working on, you stumble across something that's interesting. It's not worth an article, or it depends highly on an illustration that you can't get printed if you did an article on it. But you can put up a blog post and show the illustration and give a little bit of text to it, and so it's sort of I view them as a sort of secondary way to communicate to people about my interests. It's,
And yeah.
I don't think them as that formal or intimidating in any way. And it's nice to get feedback because sometimes of the I do one that's sort of the one blog is called Lesser Known Writers, where when I've been interested enough in an author to learn more than just the one book I might have read for late reviews, I will do genealogical research and post stuff about this author, what else they did, and pictures of dust wrappers and pictures of the authors themselves if I can find them. And what's nice is it gets it gets the information out there. And if people, I can't tell you how many times I've been doing that for probably close to 10 years too. I can't tell you how many times I will get an email or a comment in the comments field saying, it's so nice to see that you've written something about grandfather's books or mother's books or
Yeah.
so and so's books. And sometimes they will say, do you know about this other thing? Oh, no, he wrote this under a pseudonym. Oh, and I'm able to fill out more and sort of add more to the public knowledge about, these people. And
Oh,
sometimes this, I'm able to reprint the stuff, of some of the authors that I like. And in a sense, one Tales Before Tolkien, was a way of doing that before, I had a blog, and of course I could do longer things. But one of the other things I did was, Mark Hooker discovered this very strange little poem about an orc that was in an American children's magazine in about 1950.
I read this one.
No, no reason Tolkien would ever have seen it, but it's got its own illustrations, and it's about an orc, very Gollum-like, in both visuals and in the details. So I put that up, and it's fun, It's it adds a sort of dimension to discourse that you otherwise don't have, because and I found blogging rewarding. I don't actually do social media. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter or any of those things. I just I tried them and I found them too distracting, in
Yeah.
the sense that you either have to participate in them daily or not at all, because it's not like you can skip them from a week and go catch up. You just can't,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I found that, rather unrewarding. So so blogs, sometimes I'll go months without posting on one blog, and sometimes I'll finish up three things and I'll post 2 or 3 days apart. But it's I don't view it as anything other than an occasional, fun sort of thing. And
Sure.
I get enough feedback that I do know that people appreciate it, and that's always nice.
Well, I actually read that article on the orc, and that was on that was Tolkien and Fantasy .blogspot.com. But I'll put some of the others the web addresses in the description here. Well, Doug, I've kept you for about an hour. I want to ask you one question from that's related to the story for the main part of our podcast, and this is the chance for my guest to kind of just talk about what is possible, right? Or opinions, and a lot of times scholars are uncomfortable with that, but I find that sometimes they're the most interesting part of the podcast, right?
Uh-huh.
Other than following, finding out more about a scholar that you love. The listeners love to hear all of these theories, and so this is the chance to sort of flush these things out and really get into the nitty gritty of various aspects of the story. And so your episode, I think I said 135, is going to air sometime in early July, and it's going to be right before our characters um, go to what's left of Thangorodrim. And you might be asking yourself, well, how is that possible? Well, in our story, we're talking about the Dagoreth, the second prophecy of Mondos prophecy, which was, apocryphal writing, right? Like things that maybe Tolkien hadn't ever really flushed out or decided to make canon. But
Canon is a highly disputable.
yeah, well, so this in this there, as a plot device, one of the bad guys was a Maiar who worked essentially for Morgoth, who was able to bring people back from the dead, and that was a way for our characters to really get to meet some of the Ancalagons and the Turin and from a story standpoint, it was really cool to sort of start in Middle Earth proper, and as the story progressed, I essentially went back in time to bring these colorful characters and these places to life. And so they're one of the trials of the Valar, which is the third part of our storyline. They're doing a trial that involves essentially going to Thangorodrim, or what's left of it. And so I guess the question I have for you, we know that Thangorodrim, we know that Ancalagon essentially landed on the volcanoes, all right, which supposedly destroyed it. And we know that Thangorodrim was in Angband, and we know that most of those lands, and you can tell me if I've got any of this wrong, but most of these lands are under the waves, right, or under the water
Right.
after the breaking of the world. And so I guess my question for you would be more of like, hypothetically, we have all of these Tol Morwen, uh, uh, and there's a few other islands sort of off the coast of that was once Beleriand, right? These high places, even Meneltarma, they say is, people can see Meneltarma, right? The high point of
And
Numenor.
I think was it Himling, later called Himring, is on Christopher's map.
Yes, exactly.
You
And
know,
so these are the place. And so I guess my question for you would be, in a place that really was as large as Thangorodrim was, with three volcanoes, is this possible that there was some part of Angband, that was still sort of there and that people could visit?
I'm of course, has artistic license to say anything in that sense. But I don't see why not. I mean, you could posit that someone raised what was left of it,
Ah,
another.
interesting.
Um, so it wouldn't have to have necessarily remained, subsurface. It was what, a three-peaked mountain, basically. So the person sadly, the person who would be most interesting to respond on this would be Bill Sargent. He wrote a piece, Geography of Middle Earth in Mythlore, which probably in the mid '90s, I'd say. But I think if I'm remembering right, it mostly covered third age stuff rather than first age stuff. But Bill was a professional geologist and quite renowned his in his field, and he though he was British in origin, he was a professor in Saskatchewan,
Hmm.
and he also was a fantasist. He wrote as Anthony Swithin, which was his two middle names. He was William Anthony Swithin Sargent, Sargean. And he wrote um, 4-volume series of his own fantasy. Came out in the early '90s and suffered because, of course, publisher got acquired after the first volume by another publisher after the first volume, and his editor got sidelined, and basically they went through the motions of publishing and dumped him.
Oh,
But there are in the works reissues of them, and some of the ones he didn't publish but finished before he died are supposed to come out starting this fall, I believe. But anyways, that's getting off the point. I don't remember if Karen Wynne Fox, she might have had something about at least in locale and stuff. But I don't really see any reason why one couldn't posit that it does in fact survive in some way and can be reused.
yeah.
You know?
Yeah, well, what's great about these sort of crazy conversations that we have with scholars is that, you know, there is no real answer, but the idea is,
Right.
the breadth of knowledge that you have, like for our listeners to be able to go now and Google Bill Sargent, right? Like that's, I think that's what makes these interviews really interesting, because that's exactly what's happened to me in interviewing these people. I started, interviewing, game designers for the Adventures in Middle Earth, for D&D, and for Lord of the Rings Online, and the more they talked, the more they mentioned the Corey Olsons and the Mike Droughts, and that's sort of, and then Mike Drought mentioned you, and so like this
Uh-huh.
is exactly how you go down that rabbit hole, and I think
Yep.
that's what makes it
Oh,
interesting.
and rabbit hole it is, and it's fun too. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I want to ask you one more question, and this is about
sure.
this. This is sort of the quintessential question that I always end with, and that is like, what do you have coming up that you're excited about, that the listeners might be interested in?
Oh, I'm working on bunches of things, including third annotated Hobbit, which got sidetracked. That's not the right word. I got ceased the summers ago because of I had a lightning strike near my house, right close by, and it blew out a bunch of the electrics in my house and fried my computer. It was major, major. drawback. And I'm working normally again. But there is one thing that should be out sometime. I hope this summer that came up last year is we talked a bit about Mythopoeic Society. They have conference every year, and last year was the 50th anniversary. So they decided to do a selection of guest of honor speeches, and I had been the scholar guest of honor back in 1999, then again in 2013. And my 1999 talk was, I never offered it for publication because I sort of thought it was kind of, wasn't scholarly. It was more just sort of a fun sort of thing. So my 2013 one is presently available quite easily in Mythlore, and it's coming out in a collection that Leslie Donovan is editing. I'm not sure when it's supposed to come out. I imagine the COVID probably delayed everything, so maybe this summer, maybe this fall, or something. But I had for that Congress, I did a public reading with friends of a Kenneth Morris play called The Archdruid, and I did an essay for the program book called My 10 or So Favorite, Forgotten Fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
So I put them up on my Academia.edu page, both the Archdruid and my essay, which are sort of the signal to go look at Academia is in the book that hasn't been published yet, but a bunch of people have found it and downloaded them. So maybe your interest might be that.
Yeah, absolutely.
In other words, I work on things, and I don't usually talk about stuff in progress, but once it's imminent, I can talk about it.
Well, I will keep my eyes open for all of those things. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay, thanks very much. Good night.
Right. Though this marks the end of the episode, the road goes ever on. Until next time, join us at longwinded.one and consider giving us a review on Apple Music, Spotify, or really whichever platform you choose.